What would you do if you found out that the inheritance you killed for wasn't yours? What if, after all the planning, all the lies, all the deceit, the wealth you so desperately sought never belonged to you in the first place? How far would you go to escape a life of debt, poverty, and hardship? What lengths would you take to ensure your future was secure, even if it meant betraying the very people closest to you? This is the chilling true story of Nathaniel Abraham, a man who thought he had figured it all out. Desperate, drowning in financial troubles, and with no way out, Nathan saw a glimmer of hope in a life insurance policy, a $1.4 million payout from his elderly grandmother's policy. To Nathan, it seemed like the perfect solution to his overwhelming debts. He could finally escape his financial ruin and live the life he had always dreamed of. But Nathan didn't anticipate one thing, the twist that would shatter his entire plan. What happened when Nathan went so far as to hire a hitman to take the life of his own grandmother, Eleanor, to ensure his claim on the fortune? What did Nathan overlook? How could someone so close to the victim, someone who should have been a loved one, become so cold and calculating? This wasn't just about the money. It was about the desperation that can cloud a person's judgment, the fear of failure that drives someone to commit the ultimate betrayal. Nathan's plan seemed perfect, but there was one detail he had missed, one crucial piece of information that would turn his entire world upside down. What went wrong for Nathaniel Abraham? How could someone's quest for wealth end with their own life falling apart? How did greed and impatience blind him to the truth? But here's the real question. How many people, when faced with the temptation of easy wealth, would make the same choice? Would you have done the same if you were in Nathan's shoes? Stay with us as we dive deeper into the twisted reality behind this case, because sometimes what you want most in life could be the very thing that destroys you. In the small, tight-knit community of Pontiac, Michigan, Nathaniel Abraham's story was one of both tragedy and controversy. Born into a family that constantly teetered on the edge of poverty, Nathaniel never seemed to catch a break. From an early age, he struggled with the weight of financial hardship, a sense of failure that gnawed at him relentlessly. But there was one thing Nathaniel did have, a grandmother, Eleanor Abraham, who was a source of stability and support. Or so he thought. Nathaniel's life, however, was anything but typical. You see, Nathaniel's path was already set in motion long before his involvement in this horrifying crime. In 1997, at the age of just 11, he was convicted of second-degree murder for shooting and killing an 18-year-old man. This wasn't just an isolated mistake, but a decision that would shape his entire future, leading to years spent in prison, only to be released, but never truly free. The criminal record followed him like a shadow, making it difficult for him to reintegrate into society. What would drive someone with a history of violence and turmoil, to go to such extreme lengths as to kill their own grandmother? Was it pure desperation? Or was there something far darker at play? Something about Nathaniel's relationship with his grandmother that perhaps nobody knew. In the years following his release, Nathaniel's financial troubles continued to mount. Despite his turbulent past, he had one thing he believed could rescue him: the life insurance policy his grandmother, Eleanor, had taken out years earlier. To Nathaniel, it was his salvation, a $1.4 million payout that would wipe away his debts, secure a better future, and finally grant him the life of luxury he had always dreamed of. Could he have known, deep down, that this inheritance was never his, or did he choose to believe otherwise to justify his violent thoughts? In fact, the relationship between Nathaniel and Eleanor was one of complexity. On the surface, Eleanor was the doting grandmother, someone who had helped raise Nathaniel during his troubled childhood. But could there have been deeper tensions that Nathaniel's desperation magnified? Was there resentment that lingered under the surface, creating a fertile ground for the seeds of betrayal? In the midst of all this confusion, Nathaniel's financial situation worsened. He was drowning in debt, struggling to keep his head above water, and yet he believed the solution to all of his problems lay in his grandmother's fortune. His thoughts consumed him. He couldn't escape the idea that the only way out of his mess was to kill Eleanor and take the money for himself. But here's where things start to take a chilling turn. What was going through Nathaniel's mind when he made the decision to hire a hitman to murder his own grandmother? Did he think the crime would be clean with no one ever finding out? Did he underestimate the consequences of his actions? How could he have convinced himself that murder was the solution to his troubles, when all he was doing was digging himself into an even deeper hole? It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about Nathaniel's growing sense of entitlement. He felt that the world had wronged him and that no one in his family, including Eleanor, could understand his struggles. But even as he hatched his plan to take her life, he had overlooked one critical detail. Nathaniel's pursuit of money clouded his judgment, leading him to a violent and irreversible decision. As he set his plan into motion, Nathaniel thought he was in control. He thought the payoff would be his reward for eliminating his grandmother. But was he truly in control, or was he, like so many before him, a puppet to his own greed? In the next part of the story, we will take a closer look at Nathaniel's execution of this plan, how he hired a hitman, how he believed everything would go according to his twisted design, and how a single moment of oversight would undo everything he thought he had secured. As Nathaniel Abraham's debts continued to pile up, the weight of his financial burden became unbearable. His desperation was growing, and with each passing day, the walls of his life seemed to close in around him. He felt trapped. No way out except for the money he had convinced himself was rightfully his. Eleanor's life insurance policy had become the key to his escape, but there was one problem: Eleanor herself. The thought of waiting for her to pass naturally was no longer enough for Nathaniel. The plan at first had been to simply wait and hope for an inheritance, but as time dragged on and his financial situation worsened, he could no longer afford the luxury of patience. His dreams of a fresh start were slipping away, and he couldn't stand the thought of losing out on his future. That's when the idea of murder began to take root. How far would you go to get out of a financial hole? When the world feels like it's closing in, is there a line you wouldn't cross? For Nathaniel, that line blurred with every passing moment. Nathaniel, in his search for a way to expedite the process, began asking around, desperate, seeking out people who might be able to help him solve his problem. It didn't take long before he was introduced to someone who could do just that. A hitman, someone who could take care of his grandmother once and for all. The thought of actually carrying out the deed himself was too much for Nathaniel. He needed someone else to do the dirty work. But hiring someone meant crossing a line that would never be undone. Nathaniel, already blinded by his desperation, didn't seem to understand the finality of his decision. He didn't think about the lives he would destroy, the consequences he would face, or the irrevocable nature of murder. He only saw the dollar signs, the life he could lead once he had the money. What kind of person could make that leap from being frustrated with debt to coldly planning another person's death? What kind of thinking allows you to justify something so final, so permanent? Was Nathaniel truly able to rationalize this, or was his desperation clouding any trace of morality that might have remained? The hitman Nathaniel hired was a man named Joe, a figure well known in the underworld for carrying out jobs just like this. Joe had done things like this before, jobs that required quick, clean, and discreet work. Nathaniel knew that this man could get the job done without leaving any traces behind. They met in secret, their conversations whispered behind closed doors, and it was during one of these meetings that Nathaniel gave Joe the full details. Nathaniel had a clear plan. Eleanor, he believed, was vulnerable, a frail old woman with no one to protect her. He knew her routines well, the nights she stayed at home, the times she would retire early for bed. He even knew about the small security system she had installed in her house, but believed he could get around it. Nathaniel told Joe to make it look like a burglary gone wrong, something that would allow him to claim the life insurance policy without suspicion. The night was to be chosen carefully. The crime had to look like an unfortunate accident. And so with the plan in place, all Nathaniel had to do was wait. Days turned into weeks, and as Eleanor's health began to decline, the tension in Nathaniel's home grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Each day brought him one step closer to his goal, and one step closer to the unthinkable. his impatience grew. Imagine that kind of pressure, that constant awareness that everything hinges on this one act. How do you prepare yourself for something so final, knowing that once you take that step, there's no going back? The night of the crime came on a chilly evening in November 2007. Nathaniel had spent weeks building up to this moment, growing more anxious by the day. Eleanor had no idea that her own flesh and blood was plotting her demise. As she sat in her chair that evening, perhaps reading or watching TV, Nathaniel's plan was set in motion. Joe arrived at Eleanor's home around midnight, under the cover of darkness. He was masked and dressed in dark clothing, prepared to carry out the task quickly. Nathaniel had made sure everything was set. There were no other family members around, and the house was isolated. Joe entered through the back door as Nathaniel had instructed. It all seemed to be going according to plan. But as the events unfolded, something strange happened. Joe didn't immediately carry out the plan as Nathaniel had envisioned. Instead, he was forced to improvise, making sure to silence Eleanor before anything else could go wrong. What began as a simple murder plot to secure money quickly turned into a chaotic and violent encounter. Eleanor fought back. Despite her frailty, she struggled for her life, her voice screaming in the quiet of the night. Joe, now fully engaged in the act, silenced her with brutal force. Nathaniel, back in his home, waited, his heart racing, his mind filled with anticipation. In his mind, this was the final step to freedom. The money would be his, and all the pain, all the debt, would finally vanish. He believed that, at long last, his plan was going according to schedule. Little did he know that the next few hours would completely unravel everything he thought he knew. As the morning light began to creep through the windows, Nathaniel's phone rang. It was Joe. The job was done, he told him. Eleanor was gone. Nathaniel breathed a sigh of relief, as if the weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The deed was done. Or so he thought. The murder, while horrific, had gone as planned, but there was a twist in the aftermath that would make everything spiral into chaos. But Nathaniel was convinced that his future was now secured. He had the money, or so he thought. Everything had gone according to plan, at least for now. What he didn't know was that his whole world was about to shatter. The deception, the betrayal, and the cold reality of his actions would soon set in. The next chapter would expose how Nathaniel's carefully laid plan crumbled under the weight of his own greed. His hope of a fresh start was about to be dashed as the truth began to unfold in ways he never expected. What if the one thing you thought would secure your future was the very thing that sealed your downfall? The phone call came in the days after the murder. Nathaniel sat in the same chair where he had plotted the entire thing, his mind already racing ahead to what would happen next. He thought he had it all figured out. The money, the life he so desperately craved, was as good as his. His grandmother Eleanor was gone. There was no one left to stand in his way. Or so he thought. As Nathaniel paced around his apartment, his phone rang once again. The caller ID read, Mom. Nathaniel hesitated. Why would his mother be calling him so soon after everything had unfolded? Hello, he answered, his voice shaking, though he tried to hide it. Nathaniel, his mother said, her voice cold, measured. I just received a call from the insurance company. They've processed the claim. Nathaniel's heart raced. This was it, the moment when everything was supposed to fall into place. His eyes flashed with anticipation, but that moment was cut short by his mother's next words. Nathaniel, the policy wasn't for you. There was a long silence, a deafening silence. What had he just heard? Nathaniel's mind scrambled for answers. He felt like the floor had been yanked out from under him. His breathing became shallow as he replayed his mother's words over and over again. The policy wasn't for you. Anger bubbled up inside him. What do you mean? It has to be for me. I'm her closest relative. I'm the one who was supposed to inherit everything. His mother's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. No, Nathaniel, the policy was made out to me, your mother. I'm the beneficiary, not you. In that moment, Nathaniel's world shattered. The plan that had consumed him, the plan that he believed would lift him from the ashes of his crushing debts, had failed. Not only had he murdered his own grandmother, but he had also destroyed his life for nothing. Are you serious? Nathaniel's voice broke as the realization sank in. His stomach twisted, and he felt the weight of the consequences settling in. He could hear his mother's voice in the background, speaking to the insurance company, handling the legalities of the situation. But none of it mattered now. The money wasn't his. It never had been. How could he have been so blind, so sure of something that was never true? Was the greed really that powerful? Or was Nathaniel's mind so clouded with desperation that he failed to ask the most basic of questions before taking a life? He didn't know how long he stood there staring at his phone, the words, "Not for you," echoing in his head. His thoughts raced, his breath ragged. He felt the world closing in around him. What had he done? He had sacrificed his own flesh and blood for a lie that had cost him everything. The truth was like a slap in the face. Nathaniel had crossed a line that there was no coming back from. But now he had lost not only the financial freedom he craved, but also the most precious thing of all, his freedom itself. As the shock wore off, anger took its place. Nathaniel could hardly contain it. He'd been manipulated by his own mother, led to believe that the insurance policy was his ticket out. And now it was all gone. "How could you let me think that?" Nathaniel shouted into the phone, his anger boiling over. "Why didn't you tell me?" His mother, ever the calm and collected one, was unfazed. "Because, Nathaniel, you should have known better. You should have asked the right questions." Nathaniel's hands trembled as he held the phone. His whole body shook. The weight of his crime, the life he had taken, suddenly felt too much to bear. The money was gone. His inheritance was a myth, and in its place he had a trail of destruction. He slumped into the chair, staring blankly at the wall. His mind raced through the consequences of his actions. He thought back to Eleanor, to the life he had so callously stolen from her. The feeling of regret, of complete and utter devastation, washed over him in waves. He had been so fixated on the idea of wealth, of solving his financial problems with a single act, that he hadn't once stopped to think about the cost. But that wasn't the worst part. What Nathaniel didn't realize at the time was that the police had already begun their investigation. The murder of Eleanor Abraham, while initially dismissed as a possible burglary gone wrong, began to raise more questions as the evidence started to mount. The web of lies Nathaniel had woven was starting to unravel, and his future was looking bleaker by the day. His mother, still speaking to the insurance company, didn't even seem to realize the full extent of what her son had done. She thought she was simply handling business, but Nathaniel's fate was sealed. His need for money had driven him to commit murder, and the twist of fate that followed proved to be even worse than anything he had imagined. Nathaniel's quest for wealth had ended in an irreversible spiral, one that started with greed and ended with loss. And the worst part of it all? Nathaniel never even got the money, not a single cent. But how exactly did the authorities catch on to Nathaniel? Where did the suspicion begin? At first, the authorities did not suspect anything more than a burglary gone south. But as the investigators began their work, things quickly didn't add up. From the very start, Nathan's behavior struck investigators as unusual. He seemed oddly calm for someone who had just discovered his grandmother's body. His grief appeared shallow. There were no tears, no visible distress. When the police asked him to recount the events leading up to Eleanor's death, his story seemed to shift under questioning. He'd initially said that he had been out of the house most of the evening, but as they dug deeper, the details began to change. Was he at the house, or wasn't he? Had he checked on her earlier in the day? Nathan's inability to stick to a consistent story only raised more suspicions. What truly caught the authorities' attention, however, was his financial situation. Investigators soon learned that Nathan had been struggling with significant debt. He had been living beyond his means, trying to maintain an image of wealth that was simply not sustainable. As the investigation progressed, the authorities found themselves digging deeper into Nathan's life and the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's death. But the breakthrough came when a new piece of the puzzle emerged: the hitman Nathan had hired. At first, Nathaniel had thought he could control the entire situation. He believed that with a little planning and a well-timed execution, he could walk away with the money and live a life of luxury. What he didn't count on was the hitman turning on him. The hitman, who had remained a mystery up until this point, became the key to solving the crime. After his arrest on unrelated charges, he decided to cooperate with the authorities. Realizing the gravity of his involvement, the hitman provided detectives with shocking details. He described the plan Nathan had laid out for him, how he had been hired to kill Eleanor, how Nathan had promised him a large sum of money for a job that seemed straightforward. The hitman provided critical evidence, including text messages and phone records, that not only confirmed Nathan's involvement, but painted a chilling picture of the events leading up to Eleanor's death. With the hitman's testimony and the evidence he provided, investigators were able to piece together the chain of events. Nathan had hired the hitman, provided him with specific instructions on how to carry out the murder, and had even gone as far as to offer up his grandmother's house as a perfect place to stage the crime. As the police connected the dots, it became clear that Nathan had orchestrated the whole thing, but not in the way he had hoped. The investigation picked up momentum quickly. Police retraced Nathan's steps, re-interviewed witnesses, and examined his financial records. They discovered that Nathan had been using Eleanor's credit cards shortly after her death, a detail he had failed to mention in his initial statements. His movements were tracked, his phone records analyzed, and slowly, the authorities were able to piece together a damning timeline. He had thought he could get away with it, but every lie, every attempt to cover his tracks, brought the police closer to the truth. As the evidence mounted, the police knew they had enough to make an arrest. It wasn't a dramatic sting operation or a tense standoff. Instead, it was almost anticlimactic. Nathan was taken into custody during a routine meeting with his attorney. The moment he realized what was happening, his face went pale. Gone was the smug confidence he had carried with him for weeks. It was replaced by a stunned look, as if the reality of what he had done was just beginning to settle in. He had destroyed his life, and for what? For money that was never his to begin with. At the time of his arrest, Nathan seemed almost in disbelief. He had convinced himself that he had done everything perfectly. He had carefully laid out his plans, meticulously carried them out, and even gotten rid of the one person who stood between him and the inheritance he thought was his. But now, as he sat in the back of a police car, shackled and facing the consequences of his actions, the weight of his greed began to sink in. What had driven Nathan to take such drastic measures? What had led him to kill his own grandmother for a sum of money he hadn't even been entitled to? As he sat in the interrogation room, the questions kept building in his mind. Was it pure greed, or was there something deeper, something more profound, that had pushed him to commit such an unforgivable act? His entire world, once carefully constructed on lies, had come crashing down, and the consequences were now unavoidable. With Nathan's arrest, the case seemed to be heading toward its inevitable conclusion. But as the investigation continued, new details began to surface. The more the authorities dug, the more they uncovered about Nathan's motives, his entitlements, and the lengths he would go to in order to secure his place in the world. As you reflect on Nathan's actions, take a moment to consider the choices we all make in life. How far would you go to secure your future? What lines would you cross to protect what you think is rightfully yours? Nathan thought he could control the outcome of his life with just one cruel act, but in the end, it was his choices that led to his destruction. Nathan's story isn't just about greed. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitlement, the lengths we're willing to go for success, and the consequences that come when we lose sight of everything that truly matters. Nathan's life had already been shattered in the wake of the horrific crime he had committed, but now it was time for him to face the full weight of his actions in the court of law. The day of his trial was one he had dreaded ever since the investigation began unraveling the details of the murder. What he thought would be an easy path to wealth had instead turned into an inexorable march toward his downfall. As Nathan stood in the courtroom, his face ashen with the reality of his fate, the prosecution was ready. The case against him was solid, built on a web of lies, deception, and betrayal. They had pieced together the timeline of the crime, using the evidence provided by the hitman who had turned on him. The prosecution laid out the grim details: Nathan's mounting debt, his plans to eliminate his grandmother for the life insurance payout, and the cold-blooded nature of the murder itself. The hitman, who had been hired to carry out the brutal act, had played a pivotal role in exposing Nathan's treachery. His testimony sealed the deal. He recounted how Nathan had reached out to him, offering a generous payment to take Eleanor's life, unaware that his supposed accomplice would become the very one to bring him down. But Nathan wasn't going to go down without a fight. Throughout the trial, he attempted to maintain a facade of innocence, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance, someone who had been desperate and led astray by his overwhelming financial troubles. His defense attorneys argued that Nathan had not directly planned the murder himself, but had merely hired someone who took matters into his own hands. They tried to shift some of the blame onto the hitman, painting him as the sole perpetrator, but the jury wasn't swayed. The details were too damning, the evidence too clear. As the trial continued, the emotional toll on the family was evident. Eleanor's death had already torn them apart, but now, with the trial proceedings, old wounds were reopening. The family members who had once been divided by their love for Eleanor now found themselves grappling with the betrayal of a close relative. Nathan's mother, the true beneficiary of Eleanor's life insurance policy, was devastated by the revelation of her son's involvement in the murder. She had trusted him, loved him, and now she had to come to terms with the fact that her own flesh and blood had been the one to betray their family for greed. Their relationship, already strained by the events leading up to Eleanor's death, now hung by a thread. Nathan's actions had irreparably damaged the fabric of their family, and the emotional scars would take years, if ever, to heal. At the trial's conclusion, the jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a guilty verdict. Nathan Abraham was convicted of first-degree murder. The cold reality of the charges against him weighed heavily as he was led away from the courtroom in handcuffs, the once promising future he had envisioned for himself slipping away with every step he took toward the holding cells. His greed, deception, and the brutal murder of his own grandmother had led him to this moment, a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, there was a brief silence, followed by the soft sobbing of family members who had been present for the entire trial. For them, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but it couldn't undo the pain of the years they had lost with Eleanor, nor could it heal the rift that Nathan had caused between them. The weight of their grief and disbelief was palpable, as they struggled to understand how their family could have come to this point. As for Nathan, his reaction to the sentence was cold. No outbursts, no sign of remorse. He simply stared ahead as the judge imposed the life sentence. It was as if he had already resigned himself to the consequences of his actions. He had believed that the money would be his escape, a way to solve his financial problems. But in the end, he had traded his freedom for a fleeting chance at wealth, a decision that had cost him everything. Outside the courtroom, the media buzzed with headlines about the case, focusing not just on the murder, but on the shockingly cruel nature of the crime. It wasn't just about greed. It was about the twisted way in which Nathan had viewed his family, as mere pawns in a game he thought he could control. The case was a stark reminder of the lengths to which some would go when driven by desperation, and the moral rot that could fester in the heart of someone once trusted by those closest to them. For Nathan, the realization of his actions would never come. His prison sentence might have removed him from society, but it couldn't erase the guilt and regret he should have felt. He had thought the money would solve his problems, but instead it had destroyed his life, and with it, the trust and love of his family. Nathan Abraham's legacy was forever defined by the murder of his grandmother, a crime fueled by the very human flaws of greed, arrogance, and a complete disregard for the people he once claimed to love. But even as Nathan began serving his life sentence, the question remained, what drives a person to such extremes? What is it about the hunger for wealth that can push someone to commit the most heinous of acts, even against the people they are supposed to love the most? As you think about Nathan's case, remember this. Would it ever be worth it, betraying your own family, your morals, your humanity, for a shot at success? Or, like Nathan, Would you discover too late that no amount of money can make up for the loss of everything that truly matters? As Nathan's story unfolds, we are left with some haunting questions. What could have driven him to such a desperate and horrific choice? Was it simply the all-consuming nature of greed that pushed him to murder his own grandmother? Or was there something deeper? What does it say about human nature when someone is willing to cross such a line for money, even at the cost of their own family? What do you think? Was Nathan just another tragic figure overcome by his circumstances? Or is there something more sinister beneath the surface? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinions matter. And we want to hear from you. And if you're fascinated by true crime stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss out on our next gripping tale. Every week, we bring you more chilling stories of real-life crimes and the people behind them. Be part of this journey. Stay engaged, stay curious, and always remember, things are not always as they seem.